Thank you, Dr. Anthony. I think they're saving the best for last, and it's not me. It's Ambassador Ed Gabriel. First, let's capture the conundrum of Lebanon. We have two short clips I want to show you. The first one is an interview with Charles Malik. Charles Malik, he was, I think this interview was early 1950s. And the interview was about the importance of Lebanon to the world. That was back in the 50s. Charles Malik was a Lebanese academic, diplomat, and a politician. He served as the Lebanese representative to the United Nations. He also was the president of the Commission on Human Rights and the United Nations General Assembly. He was also a member of the Lebanese Parliament, and he also participated in drafting of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He was a very important player back in the United Nations. That's the first short clip, about 2 minutes. The second clip, it's a trailer for a documentary called Enough, Lebanon Darkest Hour. This film puts the spotlight on the ruling class in Lebanon and the manifold issues facing the country today. And Daizy Gedeon, she's a Lebanese Australian. She is the director, the writer, and the executive producer of this documentary. She's also an award-winning filmmaker, journalist, and entrepreneur. So let's see these two clips, please. By the way, the explosion that we saw in Beirut port explosion, there was about 220 killed and injured, and many injured from many nations, include Egypt, Syria, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, the Netherlands, Morocco, Australia, and the United States. Part of it was some of the wounded and injured there. This accident could have been treated as an international accident, or at least a spark for a national unity, but unfortunately it did not. It was just absorbed with the day-to-day politics in Lebanon. So Lebanon and its political confessional system, once universally hailed as the model of coexistence by other nations, and even the Pope did so as well. However, now Lebanon is a model of what not to be. We heard that also yesterday from General Petraeus when he said, he fears that from the Lebanonization of Iraq. So Lebanon becomes a model what not to be. And also Lebanon obviously is becoming a semi-failed state. Now, many people and many organizations around the world want Lebanon to flourish again. I mean, we're talking about it today. This is the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, and we bring Lebanon to the forefront because we would like Lebanon to flourish. There are also the Lebanese diaspora organizations like American Task Force for Lebanon, headed by Ambassador Ed Gabriel. They're at the forefront to do such things. And also there is a Lebanese American Coordinating Committee, also the diaspora committee doing those American Druze societies. There are many organizations around the world. Also, we saw this clip by Australian Lebanese. She's doing the same thing. And all of them on the same forefront to do so. Also in the members of Congress, there's a Congressional U.S.-Lebanon Friendship Caucus, co-chaired by Congressman Dahouk and Daryl Issa and Darren Lahoud and Debbie Dingell. They all have the same, they understand the importance of Lebanon, not only the Lebanese, also to United States. So the Lebanese leaders, past and present, are not incompetent. And that's not about incompetent. They do lead and contribute to a corrupt local system under consecutive foreign occupation and influence since the late 1960s. We also heard today the Secretary General when he mentioned Lebanon in his speech, and he said Lebanon should enjoy their agenda and not influenced by outside by outside partners. So the political influence of Lebanon, even in the 60s, was basically at that time when under the Palestinian Liberation Organization, headed by Arafat, it was a country within a country, so it was heavily influenced by the PLO. Later on, it was in the 80s, was heavily influenced by the Syrian regime, the father and then the son. And then from the 1990s until the present day, under the Iranian regime, and its proxies in Lebanon, mainly Hezbollah and its leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Today, the Iranian proxies control all elements of power in Lebanon: it's diplomatic power, economic power, and the military power. And also, even the current Prime Minister of Lebanon, Habib Malik, has been in his seat as a Prime Minister since 1992. So, and that he's been there for. Parliament, sorry, he's a Prime Minister. Yeah. So is Lebanon important to the United States? I'll say yes, it is. The U.S. Spent blood and treasure serving the U.S. interest in Lebanon. On blood, and the U.S. Embassy in Beirut was bombed in 1982, some of us remember that, killing over 60 embassy staff, followed by a Marine barracks bombing in 1983, killing 244 Marines, soldiers and sailors. This was the largest U.S. Marine casualties ever in one day. That happened in Beirut, Lebanon. And let's not forget the hanging of a fellow Lieutenant Colonel William Higgins. He was hung in South Lebanon in 1988. He was a member of a peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon. He was also one of the 17 Westerners that was held hostage there, including 9 U.S. citizens. And on security assistance, since 2006, the U.S. spent $2.5 billion of security assistance in Lebanon. That goes obviously to the security forces and the military forces. Last year alone was about $242 million spent on security assistance. Those are all in terms of grants. So Gulf countries, they pay cash with their own money. I mean, Lebanon and other countries, we just give them taxpayers' money. And those numbers are from the Department of State. So it's not, numbers are from their publications. And so that's some of the money, like $120 million comes from the Department of Defense budget, and to also ensure the borders are secured, to see the military, Lebanese armed forces is trained. Unfortunately, with all the security assistance to secure Lebanon's sovereignty and its borders from bad actors, the Assad regime of Syria and the Iranian regime and Hezbollah continue their illicit smuggling operations across Lebanon's land and maritime borders to enhance their interest, meaning the Iranian regime and the Assad regime interest, to undermine the sovereignty of Lebanon. Now, that was on the security assistance. On the humanitarian assistance, there's another pot of money that goes to Lebanon, and that's I know it's goes most of it filters down to the people, but that does help the system to stay on its feet. So on the humanitarian assistance, it's United States is the single largest donor of humanitarian assistance in Lebanon. So that's back in the U.S. serving U.S. interest as well. U.S. departments and USAID, they spent over $300 million in the fiscal year 20 and 21. So despite all these mentioned efforts by the United States and the world, Lebanon's still on the verge of total collapse. We can't expect the United States or the Gulf countries to solve the Lebanese crisis. Lebanon's conundrum must simultaneously be tackled from within. So I'll end it with one statement here from the current foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, when he said, "The crisis is in Lebanon and not with Lebanon." Thank you. Thanks. I have to move here. Let's do it here. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Speak from the podium if you like.
No, we'll just do a format. One thing I did not mention is there was recently we call it historic agreement between Lebanon and Israel. about the demarcation of the maritime borders. They say maritime borders because the demarcation was only on the maritime borders. The land borders is not demarcated yet. There's still issues there. So I mentioned a bit about the overall atmospherics Lebanon. I would like Ambassador to give us just a quick review of what happened in southern Lebanon and how is that might help Lebanon, and how is why the United States was so interested in making it happen.
Thank you, Abbas, and thank you, Dr. Anthony, for the invitation to be here. John's an old friend. We've been fighting these wars together for a long time. It's good to be with you. And Abbas, I should say, really served his country well, not only from a military point of view, but when he was at the State Department. He made all of us very proud. So it's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you.
I just returned from a trip to Lebanon with a congressional staff delegation, which the American Task Force on Lebanon sponsored. And so I have a lot of recent information to pass to you. I look forward to answering your questions, but I hope the audience will have time for the audience maybe to ask a few questions as well.
Bring the note cards.
Regarding the maritime deal, look, it was historic. It was diplomacy at its best. Biden leaned into this thing. He talked to the leaders of the Gulf region. He talked to the leaders in Israel. He talked to Lebanon and the French and others, and really had his negotiator in the middle of this. We give a lot of credit to our U.S. ambassador there, Dorothy Shea, who's remarkable, to the special presidential coordinator, Huckstein, to the Lebanese negotiators who really came together to make for an historic agreement between two enemies, that somehow they were able to demarcate the border, which, number one, brings a sense of stability and some security to the southern part of Lebanon. It also is going to hopefully create an opportunity for some prosperity in Lebanon. I remarked last week when I was in Lebanon, I'm glad that they didn't close this deal earlier, because any proceeds from oil and gas development in Lebanon would have gone the same way that the money has gone in Lebanon, right out the back door to corrupt politicians. So in a way, it's good that it's just being closed now. We told the leaders, including the staff delegation that was with us, we told the leaders of Lebanon last week that they are not going to see the benefits, economic benefits from this deal for 5 to 8 years. It takes that long to look for and decide whether or not there are commercial quantities of oil and gas to be extracted. So their conversation that leading up to this, we celebrated it. It was a great win for the region, and it was nice to celebrate it. But they went on to say, maybe we don't need a bailout by the International Monetary Fund now. It's a foolish comment when you think about it, because money won't be available to them anyway, and money shouldn't be put into their operating budget from oil and gas. It should be put into a sovereign fund for hopeful investments down the road. Anyway, we carried that message forth. It was a very tough message, and hopefully the staff came home feeling as though the trip was worth it in terms of that advice.
Thank you. Indeed, that was historic. I mean, if Lebanon and Israel can sit down and agree on borders, and this is maritime borders, you'll think that this hopefully will create a momentum to continue. But the problem now is we don't have a president. Right? There is a new parliament members, and some of the new members that are actually not let's say, contaminated with the old regime, and they're trying to have a voice in electing a new president. So what do you think the next move here? Are we going to have a vacuum in the presidency, or do you think something is...
So we were there during a historic week last week with the maritime border closing on that deal, but also the president leaving office a day before the Constitution called him to leave, which was kind of remarkable. Look, we met with representatives of all the different factions of the parliament. There are 128 members. We met with factions and representatives, probably more than half the parliament, from the traditional party people, as well as the new politicians or parliamentarians that won election in May. The good news is the election in May actually resulted in the opposition parties getting more than the Hezbollah and its traditional allies. So Hezbollah and its traditional allies on paper is in the minority now, but only in the minority by about 5 seats. So it's sort of like our Congress here. We can't afford to lose 1 vote in order to pass a piece of legislation in the Senate, for instance, and I think it's 5 in the House. So it's a very tight margin. Same thing in Lebanon. The opposition has to come together and form a consensus on how they're going to move forward. And remember, they represent all kinds of different factions and parties. So it's a very difficult task. We felt as though, in meeting with them in the course of the week, we had about 30 meetings last week. We really wore out the staff delegation that was there. But in the course of those meetings, we felt as though the opposition was slowly coming together, talking to one another. We helped create some space for them to have conversations in which we brought large numbers of them together. So we're feeling as though they're moving in the right direction. Having said that, given the closeness of the 2 opposing factions in the parliament, we also came home with the feeling that this is going to have to be a consensus candidate for president. Now, how much of a consensus do you give to Hezbollah versus the other side? That'll tell us a lot in the coming weeks. I think it's going to be difficult for the opposition to get the 100% of what they want. They have enough to block Hezbollah from votes for their own candidate, which is good. But Hezbollah has enough votes to block the opposition's candidate. So what are they going to do down the road in terms of picking a consensus candidate? Hopefully one that's competent, a reformist, and who cares about the needs of the people of Lebanon. I think the opposition is clear on that. The question is, how long will that take? And it's anybody's guess on whether or not it's next month, 6 months from now, or longer.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just to follow up on the presidential elections, I have 2 questions that kind of along the same line. One is kind of says, who is the American nominee? I don't think for Lebanon in presidential elections. And that's funny. Okay, but the other
has to be a Lebanese who asked that question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll nominate Ambassador.
Well, I'm not a citizen of Lebanon.
Okay. The other one is we're seeing the Gulf countries are trying to normalize relationship with Syria, and so would they think would that if that happens, is there any indications that Syria or Syrian regime might play a bigger role now, in if not in electing the president, maybe just to hedge or shape the presidency in the near future?
So on who's our choice, the U.S. doesn't have a choice. It would be a disaster for the U.S. to stick its nose into that mess. I think the United States has been clear, though, in saying that they hope that the Parliament chooses a president that meets the needs of the people of Lebanon and has the competence to lead it out of this disaster. To go further, I think, is a mistake. And I know, I mean, we heard this in so many circles. Almost every meeting we had, people said, come on, tell us, who is it? The United States does not have a candidate, nor would it have a candidate. I want to be clear in that answer, and I think that's what we heard from the ambassador while we were there as well. In terms of the Syria issue, let me answer it in a kind of a different way. I think that the United States, France, and the Gulf countries can play a big role in helping the various parliamentary parties as they try to deliver humanitarian aid to their people. The poverty rate is now 80%. Yeah, it's a mess. And the United States gave $700 million last year to Lebanon. France is in there, other allies. Unfortunately, Iran's in there through Hezbollah and otherwise. Well, I really believe and they're supporting Hezbollah parliamentarians in their districts with humanitarian causes. I think it's really important for the Gulf countries to look at Lebanon. They don't have to get money to the government, to a corrupt government. We don't want that to happen. The U.S. has never given money to the government. But there are universities. There's the Lebanese Armed Forces, which is the only competent institution holding that country together. There's humanitarian relief, civil society, hospitals. There's so much that can be done. And there's so much influence that they can lend to the Sunni parliamentarians and to bring them along to make sure that they're meeting the needs of their people, and hopefully that leads them to vote the right way as well. So I do want to say that. When we do not, you know, there are Syrian-oriented parties in Lebanon, but we think that the opposition is strong enough now to block that, those candidates from happening. We'll see. But right now they appear to be able to block those. Let me say one last thing on that. It's remarkable that they're going through a democratic process in a way. It's a little sloppy. It's not the best in the world, but it's a democratic process in which they're fighting with each other to elect the right kind of president. So let's hope that the opposition parties remain strong, and they have friends from the Gulf, they have friends from the United States and Europe helping them to bring the needed services to their people.
Thank you. Just continuing on the aid to Lebanon, could you talk a little bit about where is the IMF and the World Bank now, and what are they waiting for to actually execute some of the loans, grants to Lebanon?
So the United States, the American Task Force on Lebanon, which I believe has become kind of a leading voice on these subject matters, and the IMF, the international community, France and others, even the Gulf countries, speak with one voice on this, and that is no relief to the current government of Lebanon. We're not going to throw good money after bad through an IMF bailout unless they show reforms. And then it'll only come in increments. If you do this reform, you get this much money. If you do some more reforms, you get more money. So it's a very well-constructed IMF relief package, but the government and the parliament has to pass about 5 bills in order to show its seriousness that it's going to make reforms on banking, on a budget, on bank secrecy, on electricity, bringing electricity to the people. They're down to 2 hours a day, electricity. It's a mess there. So the IMF and the United States, France, the Gulf countries need a partner. They can only do so much. And so now it's up to that parliament and government to do its part. We carried that message very strongly last week, but we come home a little worried that the Lebanese government and parliament aren't moving quick enough, and we worry that they don't understand that they will be a total failed state out of money probably in the first quarter of next year. So we continue to push this, but you can't just have an IMF package unless you have a partner that's willing to do the reforms necessary.
Thank you. On the electricity, you said 2 hours a day. Obviously, with 2 hours per day, you can't really operate a business or do anything. There's a lot of issues in there. So could you, since also you just came from Lebanon, could you just touch on the daily life in there? What's the hospital situations in Lebanon? What's the university student situations in Lebanon? And you mentioned the banking system. There's a lot of money lost in there. Is there any talk about people getting some of that? Just quickly. I mean, there's nothing to cover there, but just
no
social
problem,
factor.
Abbas. I'm used to your questions over the many years that we've been together, so I'm ready for you.
Just really quickly on the energy stuff, which is important. The United States came up with a unique proposal to bring Egyptian gas vis-a-vis through Syria, through an existing pipeline into Lebanon, which would go from 2 hours of electricity to about 10 hours, 9 or 10 hours, which is great. They're very close to closing on that deal, but it requires the Ministry of Energy to, one, announce a tariff package that is sustainable so that they can have electricity paying for itself. That happened this week. And two, that they put together a reform package on electricity that they can count on through a regulatory commission that would independently regulate electricity. They're still arguing with the World Bank on that. Once that gets done, there'll be enough funding initially to get that program off and running. So this deal deals with a quick short-term fix, as well as the World Bank pushing Lebanon to just put forth the package, put forth the reforms that you're going to do, and show us that you're going to advertise for the independent regulatory commission. Once that starts, we'll start to give you a little money to get the electricity through the Egyptian deal. So that's short and long term. We met with 3 universities while we were there. Lebanese American University, the American University of Beirut, and the Lebanese University, the private university with over 80,000 students. The staff came home feeling very strongly that there are 2 institutions that they got to support and America's got to get behind: the LAF, Lebanese Armed Forces, and the 2 universities, the 2 American universities there. There may be other universities too that come up. Now, on the Lebanese university, which has the most students, it's sad. They don't even have pens and papers. They're having the students right now do their studies virtually. We're losing about 40% of the hospital workers and university workers, professors. It's really tough. They have a $36 million program into the World Bank to help save a lost generation potentially at the Lebanese university, the public university, and we'll be pushing for that this week. But look, Lebanon was known for its education, about its health care, its pluralism in so many ways, and now those 2 things are in jeopardy. So I think we come home with a new feeling about supporting the health care and the education. On health care, you know, ATFL organized over a $50 million flight after the explosion of medical supplies and medicines, and But you know, that's kind of sticking your finger in the dike. We got to do more than that. And we're trying now to get volunteer doctors in the United States to team up on a program that would bring Lebanese institutions and doctors with American institution Lebanese doctors to help fill a void, because we think that the healthcare problem is not short term. It's going to be at least medium term. On the deposits, it's part of banking reform. So here's a proposal. They got about $9 billion left. That's about it. Left in the country. Why don't they give it to the small depositors? They're going to throw it away anyway, and the small depositors won't get it. Why don't we stop it right now and say, stop your subsidies, stop your mismanagement, and think about anybody, a small depositor, which we can hit 90% of them, and then deal with the rest. However, there's a larger banking proposal out there that is debating with how you do that. Depositors under 100,000 being made whole over time versus those higher. We're coming home with some ideas here, and again, as a defender of the small depositor.
Thank you. Back to there's a question here also. We mentioned the role of United States in this agreement. There's also France has a big role to play, and through also the Total, right, their gas or oil company, and I think they will be doing the exploration and so on. So, what do you see, or were there any talk about some U.S. companies from the onset to be actually working in there, or this is to come?
Yeah, why not? Now that, you know, there's not a dispute. My background's in oil and gas and electricity, so I know a little bit about this. Now that the dispute and the threat of instability is gone, it will open up the market for investors to come in there in the oil and gas area. Total has that lease. They will farm in, partners. They will bring partners in. Some of those could be American. There's no reason not to. And I'm sure that many U.S. And European companies are looking at the properties now and new leases there, as well as partnering with Total. Total will not put a $100 million well in without partners, so we'll see how that goes. Speaking of France, the U.S. and the French have a very tight relationship on Lebanon, and I think they're making good headway with the Gulf countries. And so we really have to depend on France, hopefully talking to our friends in the Gulf to say, come on in now, help the Lebanese people, forget the government for now, but help those people, and together we can maybe get through this disaster together.
Thank you. Just follow up on what you said on the French role with the Gulf state. Why you don't see the United States as kind of pushing the Gulf countries to do more in Lebanon? How do, or maybe they are, I don't see it.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
The United States is engaged very strongly with the Gulf countries. Lebanon was one of the big topics of conversation when the president went to Saudi. And it was one of the better highlights of the meeting in which they came to agreement on what to do in terms of the Lebanese armed forces and support for the people. The French, Macron has really been active in visits there, and so we're coordinating with him, but not punting in that case. We're working side by side with him, not only with Saudi, but with other countries in the region. I should mention that Qatar just came through with $60-some million to help the poor LAF families who can't, the Lebanese army families can't put food on their table. What did they make, Abbas, before this mess? It was about $400. Yeah, now they're making about $40. So they came through with $100 a month for each family. So Qatar's doing its share as well. So all of this is positive. The U.S. has given the next tranche of $67 million, so this will keep the families going. And we're also supporting the ISG there, the internal security forces. families, that is.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I see a zeros in front of me, and we're the last panel here. But just any final thought or any things you want to say about the American Task Force for Lebanon?
Well, you know, ATFL has been around for 30-some years. I think we're gaining our strength year by year. I think we're counted on to speak the truth in Lebanon by the United States, and the United States looks to us when we come home for good advice. We're licensed to have CODELs and staff DELs, and we just hope to God to bring the American Lebanese community thinking to this proposition on a U.S.-Lebanon bilateral relationship, but especially thank Dr. Anthony for your years of service in bringing about these kind of forums. Thank you for all that you've done, and Abbas and your whole team for today's conference. Thank you.
Thank you for what you're doing, and I'd like to add that Ambassador Gabriel is also a board member at the United States Institute of Peace. So he's not just touching Lebanon, he's trying to touch whatever U.S. government needs to be. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you.
Dr. Anthony.
Okay. Thank you both for this particular session that tugs at the heartstrings of so many Americans.